Hello. Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending from where you are joining us. I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkley Center, and it's a great pleasure and honor to host today a book talk or book launch related to the new publication of our friends and colleagues on the new governance of religious diversity by Tariq Modood and Thomas Seeley. And we will be diving into a very critical and timely topic, which is the governance of religious diversity across different types of regime and in a very, I would say, challenging times in terms of managing diversity, even beyond religion. So their work explores how different types of regime, including liberal democracy and Western Europe, are responding to the growing pluralism, not only of religious belief, but also of cultural styles. So Tariq Modood is professor and founding director of the Research Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at the University of Bristol, and Thomas Seeley is lecturer in ethnicity and race at the University of Bristol. So welcome to both. I'm going to give both of you the floor for 20 minutes. I will then engage in a discussion with you and then open the Q&A. So to our audience, you are more than welcome to write up your question in the Q&A function, and I will address them as they come. Also, just to remind you that the webinar is recorded, and that if you have registered for the session, you will receive later a link to the recording. So with no further ado, I give the floor to Tariq Modood and Thomas Seeley.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Thank you for this invitation and opportunity for us to talk about our book. So I'll kick off, then I'll hand over to Thomas, and then I'll come back and wrap things up. And Thomas is master of the slides. So could you take us forward, Thomas? Thank you. And again, so just to show you the book cover and to very briefly say something about the book, we believe we're offering a new theoretical framework, which we then illustrate by relating it to a number of countries. 4 countries in Western Europe and 3 countries in India, in South and Southeast Asia. And it's an interdisciplinary approach, meaning comparative political science and sociology is combined with normative political theory. And we'll give you a flavor of all of that very briefly, all of that today. And finally, the last thing at the bottom of that slide is a code, MOS 30, which on the Polity book site will give you a 30% discount. Next slide, please, Thomas. So very briefly, something about our theoretical framework. So the first thing to say absolutely, which probably is clear to everybody, is when we talk about secularism, we're talking about political secularism only. Nothing metaphysical and nothing personal, nothing to do with lifestyles, like I'm a secular person, you're a believer, nothing like that. And then, unlike many people, we don't begin with a paradigmatic framework, which tends to be either that approximating to American liberal religious freedom or to the idea of a neutral state as derived from the work of John Rawls, or French laïcité. We don't begin with any of those because we think there are multiple secularisms and one shouldn't, at the start of one's study, privilege one over the other and make all the others, in some sense, approximate to or be referenced by some central or paradigmatic case. But if there are multiple secularisms, then how can we get a theoretical handle on the multiplicity? Well, our approach is to say, let's begin with a really pared down minimal definition, which is thin enough to cover all possible cases, and then to build the actual cases by studying actual histories, actual social dynamics, actual institutional power relations, and so on. So our minimal definition of secularism, of political secularism, that applies, to, we believe, to all cases, is this, highlighted in yellow. It's the idea of political autonomy, namely that politics or the state has a raison d'etre of its own and should not be subordinated to religious authority, religious purposes, or religious reasons. You should be able to see straight away that we don't mention religious freedom, for instance, which of course we think is important and which is an essential feature of liberal secularism, but it can't be part of the definition of secularism because, look, USSR and China, they are examples, everybody would agree, of secular states, and they don't build religious freedom into the idea of secularism. So two-way autonomy, freedom from the state and freedom from religion, is important to liberal secularism, but can't be the baseline definition of secularism. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, so I'm going to just briefly cover 3 of the 5 modes that we discuss in the book for the purposes of this presentation. And the first one I want to say something about is one that we develop and discuss in relation to 3 country cases in South and Southeast Asia, India, Indonesia and Malaysia, and the mode that we call pluralistic nationalism. So, at independence from colonial rule, religious diversity and its governance occupied a central concern for those drafting new constitutions in these countries. And they were particularly occupied with trying to create a sense of national unity, but one with pluralism and diversity at its heart. And in large part, this meant acknowledging the significance and centrality of religion to the life worlds of the populations, as well as trying to guard against majoritarian dominance. The Indian constitution, for example, adopted the principle of no establishment and gave equal rights to all citizens, but it also permitted a much greater mingling of state and religion to recognise the deep diversity of the country. A significant part of the settlements in both Indonesia and Malaysia was a development of national philosophies, and both of these asserted the centrality of religion to each country, whilst at the same time establishing a foundation of an idea of unity out of the plural religions represented. In terms of freedom of religion in these country cases, what we observe is an emphasis on groups and what has been called institutional religious freedom as a significant kind of norm that operates. And forms of institutional accommodations and state-religion connections were established across a variety of spheres, including education, places of worship, as well as others, and as well as mechanisms for policy consultation and influence. And this secured a good deal of autonomy for religious organisations and groups. A further important factor here is in all 3 countries, albeit in different ways, but there are forms of legal pluralism drawn along the lines of religious community, which allow those different religious communities to run certain affairs according to the personal law codes, particularly in areas of family law, marriages, divorces and the like. And so the operative premises in these cases are based on the conviction that living with diversity requires something more than simply granting the same basic rights to all citizens. But there's an emphasis on a kind of form of moral groupism and a differentiated form of citizenship. However, in relation to these cases, we can also say something about a different one of our modes, and that is majoritarian nationalism, and something that in relation to these countries we see as significantly qualifying these pluralistic kind of settlements and arrangements. And so a core feature of this is that all of these countries have seen strong assertions of an ethno-religious nationalism connected to the religion of the majority. and that this religion has become significant in defining the citizenry and the identity of the country. In Malaysia and Indonesia, we see processes of what have been called Islamization or Shariaization, where formal legal and policy measures, as well as political and social discourses and narratives, have increasingly come to reflect and assert the Muslim and Islamic dominance of the country, and even to effectively capture some parts of the state and to push this agenda. This majoritarian pressure has increased the scale of restrictions on minority religious expression, and this is true not just of non-Muslim minorities, but also of Muslim minorities that are considered deviant from the official state form of Sunni Islam. In India, the most relevant aspect here is the BJP and the political ideology of Hindutva, which equates Indianness with Hinduness, and has resulted in numerous and consistent instances of violence, but also other forms of targeting, such as economic boycotts, directed against minorities, especially Christians, and perhaps more especially Muslims. And this has seen lots of violence and persecution in the informal and social spheres, but in ways that the BJP government and senior leaders and police have been either complicit in or have perhaps even actively encouraged, and which has gone a long way towards eroding the more pluralist settlement. The third and final mode, I'm just going to say something about here, is one that we developed primarily in relation to three Western European countries, the UK, Germany and Belgium, and it is one that we call moderate secularism. So here we see on the one hand that freedom of religion as freedom of conscience is guaranteed as an absolute right. But each of these countries also represents strong forms of state-religion connections, allowing greater scope for forms of freedom for practice and to manifest religion in the public sphere. The UK, or England more precisely, is the only case here that has a kind of formally established church in the Church of England, and as a result retains certain privileges and a kind of status slightly above others. But this is fairly weak, and it can actually play a positive role in facilitating diversity. And beyond that, and in Germany and Belgium as well, state religion connections that provide official recognition where the state partners with religious groups are the norm. In Germany, for example, this is secured through gaining public corporation status. These routes are open to a number of religions and have been extended to newer religious minorities and groups in recent decades. Two important areas where we see this happening were kind of quite significantly, and we see the idea of religion being a kind of a public good and one that is elicited by the state, are in education and welfare service provision. In terms of welfare service provision, it's probably not too much of an exaggeration, certainly in relation to the UK and Germany, to say that state welfare would be severely disabled, if not collapse, were it not for the cooperation with religious groups. And religions also play a central role in education, where they operate in a public school system supported financially by the state. In Germany, for example, they provide religious instruction to people of that faith group, and faith school provision has expanded in the UK. So in the main, through these kind of cooperation agreements, the norms in these countries go beyond just a privatized view of religion and beyond just kind of an emphasis on freedom of conscience. Religion through these arrangements is seen as a public good, providing public services, and is supported by the state. Now, these types of measures have, of course, not been without criticism or controversy. They can be very uneven and also have come with forms of regulation and interference. Of course, Muslims have been at the forefront of this in recent years, and mosques and Muslim organisations have faced greater scrutiny, interference, conditions, and so on, in a context that's characterised by fears of Islamist extremism, and policies of securitisation have come to mark some of these state-Muslim relations in particular. Nevertheless, though, in these countries, what we maintain is that although we do see regulative aspects becoming enhanced in some areas, This has happened without actually calling into question the public good function of religion and state-religion connections more generally. And now I will hand back to Tariq.
Thank you. So that, very briefly, is what you might call our comparative political science theory with 5 modes, though we've just illustrated it with 3. But we don't just offer a comparative account or a descriptive account or leave it with a kind of normative relativism, because we ask ourselves, how should we evaluate the multiplicity of cases? And the position that we develop, we call multicultural secularism. So like liberals, we include and value individual freedom, but not hands-off neutrality, because we think that no society can be culturally neutral. All societies, all polities have to have a view about religion, about the place of religion. What is the view that we're recommending? Well, respect for religion, we think that it should be. What kind of respect? Well, how do we respect other group identities? So we want religion to be part of multicultural respect in the way that we have ethnocultural, ethno-racial, and other kinds of groups within multiculturalism. And very briefly, you'll understand that's about equality, not just about sameness, but equality that respects difference. And it's about anti-discrimination, but also de-othering, in particular, deracialization and anti-Islamophobia, but also, and this is the multicultural part, also having positive identity inclusion within the national polity or the national identity. This is where it clearly goes beyond simply a liberal conception of religious pluralism. And we think this should be done on the basis of 2 principles. The first one is the principle of identification, namely that the state should strive to enable citizens to identify with their political community. Such identification is good for both intrinsic and instrumental reasons. Intrinsically, citizens benefit from being able to identify with their political community. That is to say, it's good for individuals to feel they're part of that community. And the instrumental reasons, well, if they can all so identify, it's easier for certain goals, for other goals to be achieved, not necessarily even to do with religion, such as public order, civil peace, security, and anti-extremism. We also have a second principle of discretionary recognition, which is that a state may give additional recognition to one or more religions. That is to say, it may do so above that level required for identification. And it may do so for a variety of reasons, including historic importance, significance for national identity, social contribution, and so on. And 2 clear examples are, for instance, where Church of England has discretionary recognition that goes beyond the basic level in the United Kingdom, and Sunni Islam in many, if not all, Sunni majority countries. But there's an important qualification. Next slide, please. And that is that amongst our 2 principles, between our 2 principles, there's an absolute priority. The first principle, identification, has absolute priority over the second principle of discretionary recognition. So discretionary recognition is impermissible if it threatens the principle of identification for all of the citizenry. But we do think that granting discretionary recognition doesn't necessarily undermine the latter. One would have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But if and when it does not do so, and this will have to be established through democratic dialogue, then discretionary recognition is legitimate. And that takes us to our final slide, which says, well, what's a virtue of our position? we think that no religion is being given any special or privileged recognition, because recognition is a matter of democratic debate. Yet it's compatible with, and so leaves open for debate, mono and multi-establishment and no establishment. As long as our criteria are met, we could end up with any one of those in different contexts. So what distinguishes us is that we do not hold either of these two following positions, A and B. We don't hold that in a multicultural secular democracy, mono-establishment can never be justified. And nor do we hold B, that in a multicultural secular democracy, differential recognition, whether it be symbolic, legal, resource provision, can never be justified. We think that both of them could be justified depending on the context. It all depends on the historic importance, the significance for national identity, and the social contribution of the different religious communities at any one time, and that all these matters are matters that should be resolved through democratic debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. For the sake of launching the discussion with our audience, I would like to give a few remarks. First, let me say again how much I enjoy the book and how much it is needed to look at what you call political secularization. And I really appreciate the effort of identifying what political secularism is, because we live at a time where indeed scholars from different disciplines are using the term secularism, but they never really identify what they are referring to. And there is the institutional level, the social level, and the individual level. It's clear that you are positing your work at the institutional level. And that's very relevant and heuristic to say it up front, because sometimes you hear people, oh, secularism is dead. What is dead exactly? If we look at what you are looking, it's far from being dead. It's going on and on, back and forth, and there are continuous tension. So for now, just let's focus on what I would call institutional secularization and that you call political secularism. And here I would like to tease out a few things, because you talk about governance of religious diversity. But again, political secularism, when I read governance, I think, oh, okay, it's going to be an interaction not only between state and religious institutions, but also between state and different presence of religion in society. Because politics is not only at the state level. In other words, the way that governmental policy or interaction with religion is made is also influenced by dynamic of power, relationship, not only with state institutions, but also with other groups in society. And that's where, there is a way to look at that in a more historical and cultural way. We have had this discussion in other settings, but for example, you look at Turkey or Poland. Why is it more interesting to call Turkey from shift toward majoritarian nationalism instead of thinking, for example, of deprivatization of religion, which put into the governance, which is the governance include relationship with segments of society, including religious groups. So this would be my first question to you. How, even if you look at institutions, it would be interesting not to look at them on their own. Why the pluralistic approach in India versus, a more majoritarian approach in France, for example. Is it just because the state posited itself this way, or is it because there is a strong connection between the history, the status of religion in society, in public space, that is different, and that is, I would say, very much informing and shaping the level of institutional secularism. My second point is about the normative framework. And again, I appreciate that at a time where we stay away from normative approach, and you are really trying, it's a remarkable task to try both, meaning to be analytical and at the same time to posit yourself with some, not advice, but principles on how things could be managed differently. But here I would say that you don't go far enough into the normative approach, because we could argue that simply proposing a multiculturalized moderate secularism as a policy it should be unpacked here. The risk is to focus too heavily on accommodating religious groups without fully addressing the broader context of pluralistic and non-religious identities. And again, here I'm not talking about the personal belief. Here we are seeing eye to eye. It's more, how does your model, and that's the question, ensure that the non-religious or those critical of religion feel equally represented, which is something that doesn't come up in the book. And for me, it's essential at a time, especially in Europe, where the tension is really about the religious people who want a status and legitimacy in public space, and the one who say we cannot care less, we don't care about religion in public space. So how does a normative approach can provide alternative to this kind of polarization? And the last point I want to make, again, and it goes back to what I was saying, I'm a little concerned that religion becomes a little reified in this static categorization. And again, it goes back with the continuous evolution. How does one country start in one group and ends up in another is also interesting. It's not just putting them in these categories. I'm sure that in 25 years or 30 years from now, some of these countries have moved, and you do this, you really capture that and try to explain how. But then the question is, how do the categories can also adjust to this continuous evolution? And for me, it's more in terms of ideal type than categories as such. And again, it's about looking at something that is very challenging to capture, the continuous interaction between the institutional and the societal level of secularization. I will stop here to give you the time to address my remarks, and then we open the floor to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So maybe we can't address everything that you've raised, though important though it is, just for reasons of time. So if you like, I'll pick one thing out, Thomas, and pass over to you. And if Jocelyn says there's still some time, we can carry on responding till she says we're out of time and we should let other people come in. So I won't necessarily do it in the order that you mentioned things, Jocelyn, because it may be that certain things Thomas would like to address. Let me go for the point that you made about the normative framework, that you value that we're attempting this, but you feel it's, if you like, just too focused on the place of religious groups. And what about other people, and especially in societies where religious groups are becoming minorities, you know, like the United Kingdom and a lot of Europe. As you put it, that we perhaps don't go as far enough to broaden the lens to include other people. And therefore, possibly not address what is one of the features of our time, which is a certain kind of polarization between religious people and non-religious people. I think to explain that, it's best to say that our background, as we come to the topic, is, if you like, a certain understanding of multiculturalism as developed in political theory, but also in public discourse. And beyond multiculturalism, the idea that certain groups that have previously been marginalized or not recognized should indeed be recognized. So it's because we kind of take that as our backdrop without explaining it here, though actually I've worked on it quite a lot in other places. We then just want to say, well, oh, you know what multicultural respect is? We're going to apply that to religious groups and societies of religious diversity. So we're taking what you might call the larger framework for granted and just using our space to concentrate on the recognition of religious groups, not their tolerance, not their presence as part of a kind of religious pluralism, but as recognition, which is quite a higher notch, quite a more demanding normative concept than just liberal equality or religious freedom or toleration. So yes, it is true that we don't discuss possible controversies between religious groups and other kinds of groups who may also be wishing to be included and wish to be recognized. I mean, one obvious example is to do with sexual identity groups and religious groups. It's quite true that we don't do that, and nor do we offer principles for resolution, conflict resolution. What we offer is a framework for understanding what kind of normative issues are at stake, descriptively at stake or aspirationally. So I'll let you, Thomas, choose one of those questions if you'd like to.
Yeah, I won't try and go through all the notes here because of time and coherence. But yeah, I suppose just to pick up a couple of points. In relation to the third point you made, I mean, I think you're quite right that we try to develop a typology, and in a way they operate as ideal types. The modes are kind of ideal type-like. But we wanted to account for shifts, for movements, which is why we make a distinction between kind of dominant norms and qualifying sets of norms, and that they can have an effect on each other. And it may be that a country moves over time, and this is a matter of kind of, I suppose, careful analysis and this kind of thing. So in that sense, it's kind of an ideal typology, but that a country can be characterized in relation to more than one of the types, and that this can change. And I think there's something about this that's probably relevant to a part of the first point, at least, as well, which is the kind of the history, the status of religion and this kind of stuff. That's because in developing this, what we were really we developed this out of consideration of empirical cases, that which took into consideration those kinds of things. So pluralistic nationalism is developed in relation to these countries that have this deep diversity in their history, this in terms of plural religions and this kind of thing, and the status of religion in those societies. That means that particular norms are operative and arrangements are come to. I mean, we didn't cover France in the modes we had here. We have a different mode that France comes into, which we call secularist statism, which is different from the kind of majoritarian nationalism in that it's explicitly secularist in terms of the status of religion, pushing it to the private sphere, rather than a majoritarian nationalism which can flood the public sphere with religion, but of one dominant type, at the expense of others. So that's a kind of a distinction there. In relation to something else in that first point, I mean, I think we do concentrate on, I think you're quite right, that We have governance because we're focusing on not just laws and constitutions, but also norms and this kind of stuff. And of course, we're really interested in non-state actors insofar as they relate to the state and have partnerships with the state. But I think you're quite right that we are kind of concentrated on the state, if you like, and these partnerships. And so that's a feature of how we've done it as much as anything else. But of course, there's a lot more that could go into things. But I'll become incoherent if I carry on, so I'll leave that there.
Well, maybe I could add something to that. Perhaps address the point which Thomas partly did as well, about you asking us, Jocelyn, is there a risk that we are reifying religion, which we know is a genuine risk in our field? Well, what I would say on our behalf is we offered you a definition of political secularism. We didn't offer you a definition of religion. So we don't start with, or at any point, deploy a definition of religion. Religion for us is what people think is their religion. So it's not an individualistic concept, because enough people have to think it. There has to be enough of an ongoing activity, a tradition, common practices, whether they're rituals or scriptures or whatever. So we allow that to be a kind of historical development. And when people say, this is our religion, and we want our religion recognized, or we want our religious identity recognized, as opposed to our ethnicity or our regional origin or something, we say, okay, how should multiculturalists address that claim for recognition? So I don't think we are imposing any kind of template and saying, this is what religion is. If you fit this, then you're a religion. If you don't fit this, then you're not. So I don't think we're doing that at all. And as for how things may change over time, including, of course, categories changing over time, of course, I think our book actually, and our whole approach, is very attuned to the idea of change and dynamic fluidity, because we have these 5 different modes, and they are, as Thomas said, quasi-ideal types. But we don't say that one ideal type fits one particular country or one particular religious group or anything like that. We say, no, these are analytical normative perspectives, or analytical perspectives of normative clusters, institutional practices, legal, and so on. These clusters which help us to explain what is happening in a particular polity at a particular time. And in fact, we need to deploy at least sometimes 2, sometimes 3 of these modes to explain a particular society at one time, Britain now or France now or whatever. And we show the dynamic of change. We don't offer, I should say, just in case of doubt, we don't offer a causal theory like secularization or Marxism. We don't say, if this happens, then this will happen. If you have industrialization, then you will have loss of religious belief or something like that. We don't have any causation, but we have a mapping of change where norms shift because of a certain constellation or dynamic in their relationship.
Thank you. Just one word before I go to the question. The reification of religion is not, I would say, only what people are saying. What is implicitly coming up in reading the book is that the state is a major actor, is the major player, right? It's a major player. And so religion look like completely or predominantly shaped by some state's initiative. And the pushback I was aiming to was actually a certain type of norm is also the result of continuous interaction. And I'm aware, I know you are not doing causality, and thanks God that you are not doing that. But if you move toward this more complex approach, then it's a continuous interaction. And I am with you. It's very hard to propose this in an analytical framework. But there is a word of caution here that this political secularism, in other words, if I should stop right here and give the questions the attention they deserve, is to say politics is not only state. And that's because norm is not law. Norm is also what people carry with them as thinking it's right or wrong. And state policy are sometimes working with that, sometimes clashing with that and changing that. So again, the reification is not about imposing a definition of religion here, but taking the religion through the lens of the state only. That was my pushback here. So to be continued, of course, we can.
Yes, happy to hear other views, other questions and so on.
Yes, yeah. So the question here, I have one. First one, have you come across the rights of nations and the notion of spiritual sovereignty of John Paul II that was expressed in the 1995, sorry, at the 50th anniversary of the UN General Assembly. And that was the push or counterpart to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Any thought from one or both of you on that?
We didn't look at that. I mean, we haven't looked at any particular religious tradition and its perspective on human rights or its normative perspective. I don't know whether you can add anything, Thomas.
I mean, not really. I suppose the only thing that we cover that might be relevant to that, perhaps, I guess, is in terms of multicultural secularism, at least, that we place an emphasis on two-way autonomy rather than one-way autonomy, that although religious authority might be subordinate to the state, it has its own autonomy where the state is more restricted in the extent to which it can interfere, and it should respect the autonomy of religious organisations as far as within kind of parameters. So I don't know if that speaks somehow to the idea of spiritual sovereignty that we build in this kind of idea of autonomy, but yeah, that's the best I can offer.
Yeah, I'm not going to respond to the question because that is not addressed to me, but this is also something about the governance of religious diversity that goes with, it's not only state politics. There is more and more pressure, even on the state, on some transnational global movement. And that's also something I think that is challenging, not only for the state, but also for domestic religious communities. You know, so it makes the picture even more complex. So I don't know, we could not respond to this question as such, but it's this level of also state policies being nested into a more national, international and transnational dynamic of power. Then we have another question. One of the conflicting issue is in the regulation of religion is the building of worship places. With your approach, how do you think to address the request of many denominations with minority religions that would like to have their own religious place to pray while the majority of the population in the location is from a different religion?
Yeah, so we are very keen to bring a multicultural normative perspective to bear on religious diversity. So obviously multiculturalism is very attuned to majority-minority relations. So there would have to be accommodation of religious minorities. And one of the differences I would say between a kind of what you might call a liberal accommodation and a multicultural accommodation is that liberal accommodation often tries to have a uniform standard. So it says, well, if religion A, let's say Church of England, is allowed X, then another religion should be allowed X, otherwise there's an element of discrimination, double standards. Whereas the multiculturalist perspective certainly incorporates that, but it doesn't stop there, because it asks, what are the specific needs of a minority group, whether we're talking about a religious minority or any other kind of minority, because it's about difference and not just about sameness. So one of my favorite examples is that in Britain and lots of other countries, Christian parents don't make any dietary requirements for their children at school. They can be fed whatever the school wants to feed them, though of course we all know it's a culturally conditioned cuisine. But some religions, like Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, they have dietary rules, and parents will say to the school, please don't feed them this, or please make this option available at lunch, amongst other options. And some people have turned around, some liberals turn around and say, no, 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 no. We must have a common standard for all religions. If we don't do it for Christians, then why should we give preferential treatment to a minority? For a multiculturalist, that's not preferential treatment. That is meeting a distinctive need. So your particular example was about regulation in terms of places of worship, and that can, obviously issues arise, for instance, about church bells versus the call to prayer, the azan. So all these things have to be worked out so that the needs of minorities are met, which isn't a blank check, because always there has to be some negotiation, because several needs are always relevant, but the minority needs mustn't be pushed aside by reference to majoritarian practice or acceptance.
Thank you. Thomas, do you want to add something to that?
No.
No. So there is another question on the nation. So the question is as follows: you suppose the nation has a raison d'être of its own. Do you explore the question of the purpose of nation, the purpose of governance within its historical and ideological context? What justification do you give for this raison d'être?
Would you like to go first, Thomas, or shall I?
I don't think the way you smiled there suggests.
Up to you, yeah.
Let me say something, and then I can help you. I suppose notwithstanding the importance of the local or the transnational and these kinds of things, one reason is that nation states remain the main kind of political unit in which citizenship is granted, in which people, and through that rights are granted and secured. And of course, nowadays they are mostly extremely diverse in terms of religion as well as other things. So this kind of political community and this kind of political arrangement has to manage that kind of diversity and kind of, in theory at least, in a kind of normative stance, reflect the diversity rather than a majoritarian dominance. And I suppose we start with multiculturalism and build up from there. One of the purposes there is to think about how to multiculturalize, how to recognize that kind of diversity within those political communities which are formed around nation states. But I'll let Tariq take that from there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I have actually anything to add, because we do take the existence of nation states, which of course are all very varied. I mean, Luxembourg's a nation state, the United States of America is a nation state. So nation states is a highly, highly variable bag. But we do take the existence of, state authority for granted, but we also take religious authority for granted. We take, if you like, we take lots of things for granted, as one has to in order to unpack something. So while we like to take some pride in the range that we've covered, it is quite limited. We don't ask ourselves questions like, why do nation states exist? How did they come into existence? Should they be replaced by some other kind of political system?
And there is a follow-up question, and I think we're going to close on that because it touches back on also what you were discussing on the needs, for example, of particular group. I'm going to just read the question. Are there religious traditions that cannot retain their authentic belief and practice, divested of any political state governing authority? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so that's quite a major question. I think I would say there probably aren't any. I can't immediately think of any. So a lot of people think of Islam, or different versions of Islam at different times, as being very state-centered because the Prophet Muhammad set up a political community as well as a spiritual community. But obviously, there can be Muslim communities without state control. I mean, Britain, we have a Muslim community here, and we don't have a Muslim state. So I don't think it's quite true to say that I can't think of any particular religious community that divested of state authority or state support would lack its own authority amongst its own believers and adherents. So I actually think the more difficult question is the other way around, actually. And I thought that's what, when I first started reading your question, that's what I thought you were asking, whether are there religions in the world, past or present, that have had to make various adjustments, doctrinal, organizational, sometimes just pragmatic adjustments, in order to live with certain kinds of states? And the answer to that surely has to be yes, perhaps all the time, some adjustment or other. I mean, the state is a very powerful entity. And by the state, I don't just mean a machinery, an apparatus. I mean, its citizens as well. The demos and its instruments of rule is a very powerful organization. And yes, religions continuously have to adjust. The Church of England was created by English monarchs, Henry VIII and then Elizabeth I and so on. So, I mean, religious authority is continuously being either imposed upon, which of course we're not in favor of. Our multicultural secularism wouldn't be consistent with that. But religious authorities and communities also make adjustments, sometimes under subtle pressures, even where it's not coercion. But societies change all the time. People are always adapting to each other because the state also adapts. So the point that Thomas was making about two-way autonomy also relates to two-way adjustments. But the state, especially a democratic state, with the legitimacy that it has from a demos, is a very powerful force in the modern world, and most religions adapt to it.
Thank you, Tariq. I would like to back your assessment right there and say that I do not know through the work I have done, and I can sound a little affirmative, assertive here because I spent a lot of time looking at different traditions beyond Islam, Christianity, Hinduism. I do not know any religious tradition that has not been challenged in its understanding again of politics, not limited to state in terms of taking on your own norm and trying to live with them in a certain environment. All of them, including Western Christianity. It's because Western Christianity has the longest interaction with the quote-unquote secular state, doesn't mean that it came easy. Actually, the challenge was quite hard for Christianity. So yeah, none, absolutely none, has smoothly adjusted to this new national state context. So yeah, a lot of work to coming to us. So if there is no more question, which I think is the case, we'll now close this hour. Thank you, Tariq, and thank you, Thomas, for this very stimulating discussion. And thank you all for having joined us for this hour. And you will receive the link to the recording. Thank you. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Thanks all.